Hello and welcome. So in this video series, I'm going to be breaking down what is the Kybalion and what are the 7 Hermetic Principles. In this video series, not only are you going to be learning the general gist of kind of like the cliff notes of what this book is all about, but I'm also going to be sharing some of my thoughts about it and the certain things that it has instigated me to think about and in my own personal growth journey. Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Gabby and we're here to help you be the hero of your story. So in this first video, I'm going to be breaking down the introduction to what the Kybalion is. In the next videos, I'm going to do breakdowns of what each of the 7 Hermetic Principles means in detail. At the end of this video, I'm going to give you an overview of what the 7 Hermetic Principles are, but I'll save a further, more detailed breakdown for future videos. But this is just the overview of what the heck is the Kybalion anyway. So the first thing to know is that the Kybalion is a basic collection of the principles of Hermetic wisdom. It has been known as the Secret Doctrine, the Master Key, and it supposedly came from this person known as Hermes Trismegistus, who is called the Great or the Master of Masters. Now who the heck is Hermes Trismegistus? This guy, Hermes Trismegistus, is known as the father of occult wisdom, the discoverer of alchemy, and the founder of astrology. This person, if he was a person, was said to reside in Egypt in the earliest time that is really known of or recorded of. He was said to be a contemporary of Abraham, and the fact that, that even Abraham got his teachings from what he learned came from Hermes. So obviously it's unclear whether Hermes is considered this immortal being or if was this fully mortal person. However, it is essentially said that he was the earliest teacher of this great laws of the universe and of philosophy as we know it. And so he was said to have lived 300 years in the flesh, supposedly around the time contemporary with Abraham, but also older than that, and supposedly he lived 300 years in the flesh, but it's unsure and unclear. No one actually knows for sure when that time was in actual number form. We don't actually know because it was such a long time ago and it was so poorly recorded, or it was lost to history. And so Hermes was such a great teacher and such a great philosopher that people would travel from across the Ganges to receive his wisdom. And his wisdom of all of his thoughts that he perceived about the nature of reality and these principles that he essentially ended up discovering actually became the root of all other religions, is supposedly. And this is because people would travel across the Ganges, and because he was the oldest, essentially the oldest philosopher teaching these principles of the universe and principles of reality, all other religions were kind of born out of this because people would travel and they would learn from him and they would take their perception of his knowledge, and with varying degrees of who knows whether they are accurate perceptions, but as students of Hermes, let's say that they did gather the basic principles of Hermetic teachings. And that is why across religions you can see this commonality, especially when you get back to the root of what each religion was born out of. There is this commonality about understandings of the universe and understanding the laws of nature and the laws of reality and the laws of essentially our highest self and our highest expression and this enlightenment. And there's this fundamental commonality at the root of religions, and it is because supposedly religions were all born from this Hermetic teaching, this Hermetic philosophy that came from Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes was so honored for his wisdom and for his teachings that he became a god in Greece known as Hermes, god of wisdom, and also a god in the Egyptian culture known as Thot, spelt Thoth, but pronounced Thot. In Egypt, he became known as the scribe of the gods, and the name Trismegistus actually was born after he became this god named Thot, and he became Trismegistus because they referred to him as the Great, and so Trismegistus literally translates to 3 times great, in which can be roughly translated into the Great. So a lot of times people will switch between the names of Hermes Trismegistus with the Master of Masters with the Great. Nevertheless, basically the principles that Hermes taught and these fundamental laws of reality in the universe and the nature of things were so highly valued, were so highly worshipped to some degree by, as these more religious type of groups formed around his teachings, that basically everyone came to this agreement that Hermetic principle was something that benefited the lives of ourselves, and it was something that needed to be protected. So like I said earlier, all religions kind of became born from this Hermetic philosophy because students would travel to learn from Hermes himself, and then they would eventually start learning these Hermetic principles from other students, from other masters of Hermetic philosophy. But basically, essentially all esoteric knowledge and wisdom was born from Hermetic philosophy because it's older than all of the other esoteric teachings. And so whether it was India, whether it was Assyria, whether it was Persia, all of these other nations that also have their own culture of esoteric teachings, they were all born from the Hermetic principle and the Hermetic philosophy. They all essentially borrowed from it, and you can find a common thread between all of the esoteric teachings rooted in Hermetic philosophy. Because the principles are so foundational, because one thing, as I share the principles later, you'll realize that the principles are very non-specific. They're very, very open. And I think this is why they are so fundamental and so principal, because that is the nature of reality. There's not these complicated details that when we explain them in complicated detail, then it makes sense, because the nature of reality is very open. It can't fully be perceived by us. After all, our five senses can only perceive less than 1% of all existing frequencies. And so if we were to comprehend these fundamental principles that create the operating system for the nature of reality, it can't be something that is very specific. It has to be something that is very open and vague and maybe even a little bit hard to comprehend, because if it wasn't, it would be much harder to believe that it actually encompasses the nature of reality. But because of this openness, these open principles created a place where divergent views were possible, and that is why different religions were able to be born from it. If there was these specifics, like as you might think of, when you think of religion, a lot of times certain religious groups are very opposed to other religious groups, obviously. But yet somehow they're both rooted in Hermetic principle, and that's how this kind of like dynamic play works between how these religions borrowed from Hermetic principle. They created Hermetic principle in and of itself allows for opposition, contradiction, and opposing views, which is healthy. That's part of reality. That's part of what how we're trying to teach our minds to perceive, because the nature of reality is contradictory. And because of that, when people learn these teachings, they could create opposing religions, and still at that fundamental level, they could still not, there was not necessarily conflict or argument at the time, because the principle taught opposing views to be a natural part of existence in this dimension, in this plane of existence. The teachings of Hermes Trismegistus and Hermetic philosophy essentially created this foundation of principle that the three initiates who wrote this book, who were students of Hermetic principle, call the seed truth. In this book, they call it the seed truth. And that's a great way to describe it, because it's creating these truths, but truths are like seeds, and these principles are just foundations. And from these seeds, amazing things were born from it. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of different thought processes and ideas and philosophies of religions. All of these things are born, these certain thought processes, this information in the field is born and was born from these seed truths. So essentially, in many ways, the 7 Hermetic principles create the foundation for all information in the field in this incarnation of this dimension of existence. Who knows in past dimensions of existence? However, in this timeline that we are aware of, these are the foundations that all things have seemed to have been born from. These 7 Hermetic principles are the seeds from which all life has been born. Now, the interesting part is that it's not that because these 7 fundamental principles, because Hermes Trismegistus defined them, shared them, taught them, because he did that, then we have reality as we know it. Instead, it's actually the first principle itself, which is the law of mentalism, which is that the all is mind and the universe is mental. And so in the observation of these 7 fundamental principles birthing life itself, it's the same, it's actually the principle itself, which is to say that it's not because he taught it that now this is how life as we know it. These 7 fundamental principles were simply the observation of reality itself, and reality itself is born by reality observing itself. Now, I know I went on a bit of a tangent, but that's the interesting thought process that I like to observe as I was going through and I was reading this book. I noticed how when the writers of this version of the Kybalion, the 3 initiates, wrote it, it was an example of the principle of mentalism itself. It is not because we observe these rules that they exist, but it's because these rules exist that we can observe these rules. Now, how is it that the Kybalion has remained to stay intact in its original form? How do we know that the basic principles, these purity of principles, as they are often described, how do we know that they are still in that pure form when we know that so many religions end up creating altered versions of religion in different centuries and so on and so on? How do we know that the Kybalion is still in its pure form? Well, part of the Kybalion is that in the teaching of the Kybalion there's a warning involved in it that nothing can be set in stone, that it warns against crystallizing into creed, crystallizing information into creed. It warns against turning philosophy into theology. And I think that is the big defining difference between why the Kybalion still, while it may seem cultish, it may seem religious, it inherently is not, because again, it's teaching the seed, and you as the reader, the interpreter, and the expression of a being in this incarnation on earth, you are here to perceive it. It's not something that is just rule and fundamental and set into stone. This is something that you have to be able to interpret. And in the process of having to interpret something, it is now having to go through the filter of the being, the filter of the reader, the filter of the person. And that means that every person's filter is different, and therefore you cannot come out with different outputs for every person. And I think that creates, basically, it prevents something from being a cult or a religion or set into stone. Things that are set into stone, that are cultures, that are religious, there is this, the input, the version of it that you're perceiving into yourself is already so detailed that it leaves little up to interpretation. But when the input is so vague that it requires you to have to interpret to some degree and to use your intuition and your gut instinct and your wisdom to be able to turn it into words and meaning, then it cannot be set into stone, because now that filter, the output is always going to be different. And even though we're all trying to aspire to reaching the same conclusions of what wisdom is, there's still a lot left up into interpretation of what your highest growth is, what your highest self is, and what your path to purpose is in this incarnation on earth. So you might be wondering, when I picked up this book, I was kind of confused about this, but is this like the actual version of the Kybalion? Is this the version? No, obviously not. This is not some ancient text. This is obviously an interpretive version of what is the Kybalion. The Kybalion, though, has never been inputted into one singular writing. And if it was lost a long time ago and nobody knows when it existed. But the idea is essentially that the Kybalion was always this non-tangible teaching of Hermetic philosophy that was always passed directly from the lips of a master to the ears of a student. It has always been passed down directly from master to student. And it actually did keep Hermetic philosophy intact. But then, of course, eventually along came students who wanted to share the wisdom of the Kybalion in a more concise way. And one thing that is interesting that they share in this book is that the Kybalion, when it was recorded into writing, the basic Hermetic principles, the 7 Hermetic Principles, when they were recorded as books, they were always hidden in this, they were hidden in the language of alchemy and astrology. And while this was a great thing that they did to avoid the prosecution of the Middle Ages, that's why they did it, it also left it unable to be interpreted by, I suppose, the average student. The average student didn't have the capacity to understand what these meanings were of what these alchemy terms and these astrological terms. And even now, it would probably the same would be. And so this version of the Kybalion, which is basically that general version of the Kybalion that people are talking about when they say the Kybalion, is a very humanized version of the Kybalion to read. It is easy to understand. Anyone could read it. While there might be some spiritual interpretation involved, it's easy to read. There's nothing hidden in mysticism or astrology or alchemy. It's all easy for you to interpret, and it's up to you to actually interpret. So this is just an introduction to what the Kybalion is, and I'm almost kind of through what the general gist is, but there are 2 quotes that are actually in this book that I wanted to share that are very, I think, a good example of what of setting the stage for what the Kybalion teaches, which is that when the ears of the student are ready to hear, then cometh the lips to fill them with wisdom. The second is that the lips of wisdom are closed, except to the ears of understanding. I think that sets the stage for mentally preparing you to receive the wisdom of the Kybalion. This is not, it's not law. It's not, like I said, it's not set in stone. It's not these rules that you have to follow to the T. These are guidances, and they're guidances that is interesting to me because they are guidances that your natural inclination is actually to fall into. As I'll share in my other videos, the irony to me about this Kybalion is that 2 of these quotes actually became my, what I would describe as, like my core quote of the year. When I made a video a while ago about setting New Year's resolutions, and I always chose a word and a quote. And 2 of these fundamental Hermetic principles were unintentionally the principles that I chose to lead my entire year. And so what that tells me is that about the Kybalion and about these principles is that it's natural human inclination to want to follow wisdom, to want to be guided towards your highest self, because in your highest self you find that greatest sense of liberation from all those negative emotions. You find that greater sense of unconditional love, that you find that greater sense of peace. Your natural inclination is to want to listen to wisdom, because wisdom is kind of like this thing. It's not necessarily something within us, it's something in the field outside of us that we use our third eye and our different energy centers to be able to tune into. We want to listen, but we have to be ready to receive it. We have to be willing to understand and willing to interpret what we need most in our lives. I think this, on top of bringing into account your own cages that you've blocked yourself into, gives you the perfect recipe for growing out of your suffering, growing out of your past patterns, breaking those patterns, and stepping into the life you really want. And stepping into the life you really want involves this combination of stepping into your purpose and also stepping into the wisdom that you probably already know, that's probably already there for you to step into. You just have to quiet down that inner chaos, that inner turmoil, those past patterns, suffering addictions, and just listen. And when you listen, you're going to realize that these 7 principles of 7 Hermetic principles are kind of the natural default that you would have arrived at anyway, even if nobody ever handed you this book. So really quickly before I finish this video, I just want to cover really fast what are the 7 Hermetic principles anyway. So the 7 Hermetic principles, first of all, is the principle of mentalism. The second is the principle of correspondence. The third is the principle of vibration. The fourth is the principle of polarity. The sixth is the principle of cause and effect, and 7 is the principle of gender. I'm going to dive deep into what each of these principles means in the videos that come after this. But as a super brief overview, I wanted to share the quote, or the direct translation that came from the Kybalion of what each principle is all about. So the principle of mentalism is based off of the idea that the all is mind and the universe is mental, and that everything, this is kind of the same idea really as the quantum field theory. It's essentially the same as believing in a God source, or a source field, or the unified field, or the field of love. All of it's the same, but this is all one fabric that makes all of existence. Is one singular fabric of a singularity of mind and thought and energy. The second one, the principle of correspondence, is based on the idea of as above, so below, and as below, so above. I thought this one was funny because this was one of the ones that I had chosen as my New Year's guidance guidance quote, New Year's resolution, this guiding North Star for me for one of the years, I had chosen as above, so below, and as below, so above. And I think my favorite way to think of this one is the idea that for as deep as you go within to yourself is as much you will expand outwards. That was the way I was using it as a guiding point when I first discovered this quote that I didn't realize was Hermetic Principles at the time. It gave me the assurance that the more I went deeper into myself, into my own wounds, into my own programming, into my own limitations that I had created in this lifetime, the more I just embraced it and went into it, even if it felt scary, even if it felt hard. The deeper I went within, the greater I would expand outward into my full potential, into my joy, into the things that I actually wanted in my life. I had trust that if I went inward, I would move outward too. The third one is the principle of vibration. This is essentially, again, similar to the quantum field theory, which is that nothing rests, everything moves, and everything vibrates. And the amazing part is now that, like, science knows that this is true. And what's amazing is, in theory, that if this is as old, this book in Hermes Trismegistus and this philosophy is as old as it is, then they were forecasting the validations that quantum science now knows. We know that everything is energy. We know that energy is the fundamental root of all existence. We know that we break down molecules into atoms, and atoms break down even further, and at the root, it's just energy. And it's supposedly empty. It looks like empty space when perceived under a microscope, but that's actually all energy. And so if everything is energy, then everything is always moving, and everything's always shrinking or retracting or expanding. All of this, and this is what the Kybalion says too. The fourth one is the principle of polarity. This is based off of everything is dual, everything has its poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. This is an interesting one that I like to, when I read this, the first thing I think of is how when we talk about astrology, especially when we talked about our North Node, South Node series, we talked about how oppositions on the zodiac have a commonality in the thread. So for example, the Cancer Capricorn axis is an easy one, where one is kind of more the masculine energy and one is more of the feminine energy. However, there's a underlying, and they seem like opposites because Cancer is all about nurturing and it's all about care and emotions and fluidity, whereas Capricorn's an earth sign and it's all about stability and grounding and discipline and hard work. And these seem like totally opposite. But at the same time, there's a commonality between them, which is that they're both trying to stay in control. They are both trying to create the foundations of life. Both are trying to nurture technically in different ways. They're just going about it in different ways. They're just trying to create this stability, and they're trying to achieve and control and keep, in a way, they operate under the same keeping the family thriving. But all of the zodiacs have that same opposition with a common thread that ties them together. Virgo and Pisces, Aries and Libra, all of these have a commonality, and the same goes to all areas of your life. That's why people say, you can only love someone if you hate them also. Love and hate are two ends of polarity with a commonality, a common string that's running between them, because you cannot experience one opposition without experiencing the opposite. The principle of rhythm is that everything flows in and out. Everything has its tides, all things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left, and rhythm compensates. This is another one that I ended up accidentally using as a New Year's guiding North Star, because I had to have faith that if I swung in a different direction, which is the nature of reality, everything's always moving, like the other principles say, and ourselves, I think one of the biggest things that a lot of us struggle with is that life is constantly full of change, and our natural tendency with our primal brain is to want to avoid change, and change is dangerous, and change means I have to survive. But the truth is that it's a good thing that things are constantly changing and things are constantly moving. But with that, when you're experiencing a downfall, when you're experiencing something that's swinging in the direction that you don't want it to go, there's always a compensation. It's very, very similar to the as above, so below. There's always balance that's going to move its way. And so everything has its tides. Even if you're pulling out in the tide right now, that doesn't mean you're gonna stay there forever. It's gonna change, it's gonna shift. I think this is especially helpful when you're going through like a kind of a harder time in your life and you don't have faith that you're going to move through it. The sixth is the principle of cause and effect, and the saying is that every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to the law. Chance is but a name for a law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. This one kind of comes back to the principle of mentalism too, and kind of in a way, because this is almost the idea that everything is destined. Now, this is not to say everything is destined, because as we know now with modern science, there are multiple timelines that are constantly existing at the same time. Like there's literally multiple potentials all happening simultaneously, literally multiple timelines. I'm sure it's happened it's like in movies. I can't tell you what movie because I'm disconnected from what the popular movies and TV shows are, but there's multiple timelines existing at the simultaneous moment. And yet at the same time, there's everything that you think is affecting you right now had a cause at some point in time. And it could have been something as simple as a thought, but this is the idea that everything is essentially, it's the book, The Butterfly Effect. In the Map of Consciousness, he talks about this. The Map of Consciousness is a great book that I highly recommend. I should do another video series on that book. But this is the idea that everything's happening simultaneously. So what's happening 5 years from now is already set in stone set in stone to some degree. It's based off of the thoughts that you're having, the feelings that you're having, the frequency that is existing now is creating a timeline in the future. And so everything that happens has an effect, and every effect has a cause. There is nothing that is a coincidence, and nothing is an accident. And finally, there's the principle of gender. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles, and gender manifests on all planes. And I think this one's very interesting because of the fact that when we talk about healing in Be the Hero Academy, we're talking about breaking the patterns of your old self, breaking out of your suffering, addictions, and your traumas and your inner child wounds, and stepping into the life, your most amazing life, your vibrant health, your passionate relationships, your purposeful career. That process to go from there to there requires both. It requires, we talk about this in our webinars, you need masculine healing and you need feminine healing, because you within you have masculine energy and feminine energy. Every single being has masculine energy and feminine energy. And so when we're in our feminine energy is in fact emotional and soft and caring and giving and fluid and adaptable. And masculine energy is grounded and disciplined. And we need both to be able to heal. We need that emotional nurturance for ourselves. And then at the same time, a lot of people get caught in that and they need to step into their masculine and actually do the hard work, do the stuff that sucks, and do that work with discipline to catch your thought patterns. And yes, you can let yourself have the emotional nurturance for the past patterns that show up, but you also need to be able to have the masculine energy to solidly choose new neural pathways, new thought patterns. But that's just one example. This manifests in everything. I think it's funny too, like when you think about Latin languages, like Spanish for example, everything has either a masculine or a feminine expression of words in language. This applies to everything. Everything all energy has a masculine or a feminine energy. And gender manifests on all planes. So I hope this gave you guys a good overview of what the Kybalion is. Again, now if you want to actually have a copy of this book, you can click the link in the description to get a copy of the Kybalion by the 3 Initiates. It's a really interesting book. It's actually a fairly quick read, but I like going into it still here on YouTube because this is where you dive into how do you apply this to your life? What does it mean to, sure, we can explain what the Kybalion is, but what does it do if we're just intellectualizing information, if we're not applying the wisdom, because wisdom is information applied. I'm here to help you turn the information of Hermetic Principle into wisdom by applying it to your life and using it to step into your path to purpose, in your path to your most amazing life. Okay, let me know if you guys like this video by clicking the like button. If you have any questions, or if you have any questions to ask me in my future videos, the things that you're going to want to know when I dive into what the full breakdown of each principle, let me know in the comments. That way I know to address it in the videos when I make them. Thank you guys for joining me in this video. I bow to you. Namaste.